Another strike in the Black Sea, and Ukraine is pointing directly at Moscow. Kyiv says Russian forces have hit 2 civilian cargo vessels off Ukraine's southern coast, claiming the life of a crew member and escalating fears over the safety of global food shipping routes. According to Ukrainian officials, one ship flying the flag of St. Kitts and Nevis was on its way to load grain at the port of Chornomorsk. The second, flying the flag of Comoros, was struck near Odessa while transporting soybeans. Ukraine's Restoration Minister Oleksiy Kuleba confirmed that a Syrian national working as a crew member lost his life in the attack. Kyiv says the ships were civilian and calls it a deliberate strike on shipping. Western headlines immediately framed the incident as unprovoked Russian aggression against innocent merchant vessels. But is it really that simple? Here's additional context often raised by Moscow and maritime analysts. There have been multiple reported drone incidents at sea involving Russia-bound tankers, and attribution has been contested. Moscow has called these incidents piracy and has threatened retaliation. These are not random events. They are part of an escalating pattern of maritime attacks that both sides have been engaged in. The cargo ship strikes come amid escalating maritime incidents in the region, with each side blaming the other. What Western media rarely mentions is that Russia warned this would happen. Moscow made clear, publicly and repeatedly, that attacks on Russian maritime commerce would not go unanswered. In December, Russian President Vladimir Putin addressed the situation directly. Speaking publicly, Putin made Russia's position explicit. Before that, the Ukrainian armed forces tried to attack our seaports. We reciprocated. I would like to emphasize this. We reciprocated with similar strikes. Putin continued, and I assure you these strikes were much more powerful, much stronger. And first of all, they were launched against the vessels, against the ships that were used to supply military equipment and ammunition to Ukraine. He pointed to secondary explosions as evidence that Russian missiles hit their intended targets. And you can see it from the explosions that were caused by the strikes. Secondary explosions, secondary detonation. Putin then turned the accusation back on Ukraine. And what's the Ukrainian armed forces doing now? That's piracy. Nothing else. These were not empty words. Putin was laying out a clear framework. Attack Russian ships, and Russia will respond in kind. Putin did not stop there. He outlined what Russia's response could look like if the attacks continued. What kind of response could there be? We can enhance our strikes against the port infrastructure and against the vessels that are entering Ukrainian ports. That's one. Then came the more significant warning. Secondly, if this goes on, then we will look into the possibility. I'm not saying that we will do this, but we will consider it, to perform some actions against the vessels of those countries that are helping Ukraine with these piracy actions. The implication was clear. Nations supporting Ukraine's maritime campaign could find their own ships targeted. So, we might cut Ukraine off from the sea to stop them from being involved with these piracy tactics. For Russia, the Black Sea strikes are not aggression. They are retaliation, a measured response to what Moscow views as Ukrainian attacks against civilian maritime infrastructure. This distinction matters. In any conflict, context determines meaning. An action viewed in isolation looks very different when placed within a sequence of events. To understand Russia's response, one must first understand the broader context. On Wednesday, an oil tanker bound for Russia came under attack, not by missiles, not by warships, but by unmanned drones. The Palau-flagged tanker Elbis was sailing east toward the Russian port of Novorossiysk, when it suddenly encountered what maritime intelligence describes as an unmanned marine vehicle and drone attack. The incident happened in the Black Sea off Turkey's northern coast, according to maritime tracking and reporting. The tanker requested Turkish Coast Guard assistance and diverted from its route, according to reports. According to maritime tracking data, the vessel later dropped anchor near the northern Turkish port of Anadolu, arriving under its own power. The damage appears limited. The tanker was reportedly struck in its upper sections, with some reports suggesting the engine room was targeted. No injuries were reported among the crew members. No pollution has been detected. But the message sent by the attack is unmistakable. These drone operations represent a new phase in the conflict. Ukraine has developed sophisticated unmanned naval capabilities, sea drones that can travel long distances, evade detection, and strike targets with precision. The technology is impressive. The implications are troubling. The Elbis incident is not isolated. Several Russia-bound tankers have been hit in reported drone incidents, and attribution has not always been confirmed. Some of those strikes occurred just off Turkey's coast, involving vessels traveling to Novorossiysk, Russia's major Black Sea oil terminal. Several of the ships targeted had previously been sanctioned by Western countries for allegedly transporting Russian oil in violation of post-2022 restrictions. But sanctions are not international law. They are unilateral measures imposed by Western governments. Ships engaged in commerce under international maritime law are being attacked. This is the context that Western media consistently underplays. There have been multiple reported incidents, and the pattern of attacks has raised alarms across the maritime industry. The attacks are designed to disrupt oil exports and maritime commerce in the region. Russia's response, striking vessels entering Ukrainian ports, follows the same logic. If vessels trading with Russia are targeted, Russia responds in kind. The difference is how each side's actions are portrayed in international media. When Ukraine attacks a Russian-bound tanker, it is framed as resistance against an aggressor. When Russia strikes back, it is framed as an assault on civilian shipping. The asymmetry in coverage is striking, and it shapes how the world understands this conflict. Moscow has reacted sharply to the drone incidents. Russia says the attacks violate maritime law. Others dispute that characterization. Presidential spokesman Dmitry Peskov warned the incidents are serious and could disrupt ongoing diplomatic efforts. These attacks represent a dangerous escalation that threatens not only Russian interests but the stability of the entire Black Sea region, Peskov stated. Moscow rejects the shadow fleet label and insists the vessels are engaged in lawful trade. The term shadow fleet itself deserves scrutiny. It was coined by Western media and governments to delegitimize ships that transport Russian oil. But these vessels operate legally under international maritime conventions. They fly recognized flags. They follow established shipping routes. The only thing that makes them shadow is that they do not comply with Western sanctions, sanctions that much of the world has not endorsed. The Russian Foreign Ministry called the drone attacks provocations designed to escalate the conflict and draw third parties into the confrontation. For Russia, the attacks on its tankers constitute aggression against civilian infrastructure. The fact that Western media often portrays them as legitimate operations reveals the difference in framing. Turkey has voiced growing alarm over the escalating maritime conflict. Turkey says the incidents occurred within its exclusive economic zone, and it has urged restraint. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has called for a limited ceasefire on attacks targeting ports and energy facilities. Turkey controls the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits, the only exit from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Any escalation in these waters directly affects Turkish security, Turkish commerce, and Turkish sovereignty. Ankara finds itself in an uncomfortable position. Turkey is a NATO member, but it has maintained working relationships with both Russia and Ukraine. It has facilitated diplomatic efforts, including the Black Sea Grain Initiative. It has tried to remain neutral. But neutrality becomes difficult when drones are striking tankers in Turkish waters. Turkish officials have warned that the strikes pose serious risks to navigation, maritime safety, and the environment. An oil spill in the Black Sea would be catastrophic. The sea is semi-enclosed with limited water exchange with the Mediterranean. Environmental damage would persist for years, affecting Turkish fisheries, tourism, and coastal communities. Behind the scenes, shipping insurers are already responding. After the November drone strikes, insurance rates for vessels operating in the Black Sea surged dramatically. a sign of rising fear across the maritime industry. The Black Sea is a lifeline shared by Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, and several NATO members. The ongoing drone campaign is putting that lifeline at risk. The Black Sea was once a key artery for agricultural exports. Ukrainian grain fed millions across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. The Black Sea Grain Initiative, negotiated by Turkey and the United Nations, provided a fragile lifeline for global food security. That era appears to be ending. The escalating conflict between Russia and Ukraine has transformed these waters into a combat zone. Ships that once carried wheat and corn now sail through waters where missiles and drones strike without warning. Both sides are engaged in this maritime confrontation. Ukraine has reportedly conducted drone operations against Russia-bound vessels. Russia has responded with strikes on vessels entering Ukrainian ports. The result is a maritime war that threatens global food supplies, energy markets, and international shipping. For countries dependent on Black Sea trade, particularly nations in Africa and the Middle East, the consequences could be severe. Higher shipping costs mean higher food prices. Higher food prices mean economic hardship for the world's most vulnerable populations. This is not an abstract concern. Countries like Egypt, Lebanon, and Yemen depend heavily on Black Sea grain imports. Disruptions to this trade have direct humanitarian consequences. The irony is bitter. A conflict justified partly on humanitarian grounds is creating humanitarian crises elsewhere. While Western governments condemn Russia's strikes on cargo vessels, they remain silent about their own maritime actions. U.S. forces seized the Russian-flagged tanker Marinera after boarding it in the North Atlantic, according to Reuters. The seizure marks a dramatic escalation in American enforcement of unilateral sanctions against Venezuela, Russia, and Iran. The Marinera had switched to a Russian flag on December 24th, apparently hoping Russian registration would provide legal protection under international maritime law. It did not. U.S. Coast Guard and military personnel boarded the vessel. The seizure was complete. The tanker was now in American hands. U.S. officials said they also intercepted the Panama-flagged M. Sofia carrying Venezuelan oil. 2 ships seized in one day, both in international waters, both based on American sanctions that no international body has endorsed. The operations were conducted thousands of miles from American shores. The vessels posed no direct threat to the United States. They were simply engaged in commerce that Washington had decided to prohibit. A senior Russian lawmaker has characterized the American seizures in stark terms. Alexei Zhuravlyov, first deputy head of the State Duma Defense Committee, called the action ordinary piracy. The seizure of a civilian vessel by the armed American fleet, he said. In essence, it is the same thing as an attack on Russian territory because the tanker was sailing under our state flag. Russian officials argue that flag state jurisdiction should protect a vessel from foreign seizure on the high seas. When the Marinera flew the Russian flag, it was, in Moscow's view, a piece of Russia floating on the high seas. And the United States boarded it by force, seized it, took it. Zhuravlyov did not mince words about what he believed the response should be. I think the United States, which is in a kind of euphoria of impunity after the special operation in Venezuela, can only be stopped with such a click on the nose. He called for Russia to respond forcefully to what he characterized as American aggression on the high seas. The rhetoric is heated. Whether it translates into action remains to be seen. The contrast could not be more striking. When Russia strikes vessels entering Ukrainian ports in response to attacks on Russian ships, Western media calls it aggression against civilian shipping. When the United States seizes vessels in international waters based on unilateral sanctions, it is called law enforcement. But American sanctions are not international law. They are domestic measures that Washington has chosen to enforce globally, regardless of what other nations think. The United States is asserting the right to seize vessels anywhere in the world for violating American sanctions. Not United Nations sanctions. Not internationally agreed restrictions. American sanctions. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth made the position explicit. The blockade of sanctioned and illicit Venezuelan oil remains in full effect anywhere in the world. Anywhere in the world. Consider what this means. A country can pass a law and then enforce that law against ships from other countries in international waters using military force. If any other nation did this, it would be called piracy. When America does it, it is called policy. For Russia, for China, for any nation that values sovereignty, this represents an assertion of American hegemony. Washington is claiming the right to enforce its laws on the entire planet. The Russian Transport Ministry has condemned the seizure as a violation of international maritime law. In accordance with the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, freedom of navigation applies in the high seas, the ministry stated. No state has the right to use force against vessels duly registered in the jurisdictions of other states. Russia argued that the Marinera was in international waters, flying a recognized flag, engaged in peaceful commerce. Under the principle of flag state jurisdiction, which has governed maritime law for centuries, ships on the high seas are subject only to the laws of the country whose flag they fly. Other nations cannot board, seize, or interfere with their passage. The United States, Russia argues, violated this fundamental principle. But the framing in Western media tells a different story. When America acts, it is reframed as enforcement. When Russia responds to attacks on its ships, it is called aggression. The difference in characterization reveals much about who controls the narrative. The tanker seizures must be understood in context. Days earlier, American forces captured Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro, an operation without modern precedent. A sitting head of state was seized on his own territory and flown to Brooklyn to face trial. The Marinera and M. Sofia were both connected to the Venezuelan oil trade. With Maduro captured and the Venezuelan government under siege, Washington is moving to control the country's most valuable resource. If Venezuela cannot export oil, it cannot generate revenue. If it cannot generate revenue, resistance to American demands becomes impossible. The tanker seizures are part of a broader pressure campaign. Restrict the oil. Limit the revenue. Apply maximum pressure. This is economic warfare conducted through naval power. The goal is not just to enforce sanctions. It is to strangle economies into submission. Zhuravlyov explicitly connected the seizures to the Venezuela operation. The United States, which is in a kind of euphoria of impunity after the special operation in Venezuela, can only be stopped with such a click on the nose. The message is clear. America believes it can act with total impunity. Seize presidents. Seize ships. Enforce American law anywhere on the planet. For countries watching from the global south, the lesson is unmistakable. Sovereignty is conditional. It exists only as long as Washington permits it. Zhuravlyov revealed something significant about the Marinera seizure. Russian military assets were in the vicinity when American forces boarded the tanker. According to available information, somewhere near the vessel was a Russian submarine and also some of our other military ships, he said. U.S. officials told Reuters Russian vessels, including a submarine, were in the general vicinity, with no sign of confrontation. Yet Russia did not intervene. The submarine did not surface to challenge the boarding. The warship did not maneuver to block the operation. Why? The answer is strategic calculation. A direct confrontation with American forces in the Atlantic would escalate rapidly. Russia is already fighting in Ukraine. Opening a second front against the world's largest navy would be catastrophic. So Russia watched. It condemned. It threatened. But it did not act. This restraint reflects Moscow's understanding of the current balance of power. Russia can protest American actions, but it cannot stop them militarily in waters far from Russian bases. The Atlantic is American territory in all but name. The U.S. Navy dominates these waters. Russia knows this. But restraint should not be confused with acceptance. Moscow is calculating, not capitulating. The response may come in other forms, at other times, in other theaters. The greatest risk in this escalating maritime confrontation is not deliberate war, it is miscalculation. What happens when military forces from rival powers operate in close proximity? What if a warning is misinterpreted? What if communications fail? What if someone makes a mistake? Wars have started over less. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, later revealed to be far more ambiguous than initially reported, led to American escalation in Vietnam. When tensions are high and politicians are calling for forceful responses, the risk of unintended escalation becomes real. Russian military assets near the Marinera did not fire, but they were there. American forces were there. The potential for a spark exists. In the Black Sea, the same dynamic plays out daily. Russian missiles strike cargo ships. Drones attack tankers. Both sides probe limits, test boundaries. One mistake could change everything. A misidentified target, a communication breakdown, a commander acting on incomplete information. These are the ingredients of catastrophe. What we are witnessing is not simply a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, or between Russia and the United States. It is a conflict over the rules that govern international commerce and sovereignty. The United States believes its laws apply everywhere. American sanctions can be enforced against any ship in any waters, regardless of flag state or international law. Russia believes in a multipolar world where no single nation can impose its will on others. Moscow sees American actions as an attempt to maintain global dominance through force. China shares this view. Beijing has condemned the Venezuela operation and the tanker seizures as violations of sovereignty and international norms. The Black Sea and the Atlantic have become theaters where these competing visions clash. For nations in the global south, for Africa, for Latin America, for Asia, the outcome matters enormously. Will the future be dominated by American unilateralism? Or will there be space for countries to chart their own course? This is not an abstract philosophical debate. It has real consequences for trade, for development, for national autonomy. The crisis is far from over. In the Black Sea, Russia has made clear it will continue striking vessels that enter Ukrainian ports if attacks on Russia-bound shipping continue. Putin's warning was explicit. The strikes will be enhanced. Turkey is caught in the middle, trying to maintain neutrality while incidents occur in its waters. Insurance rates continue to climb. Shipping companies face impossible choices. Global food and energy markets feel the strain. In the Atlantic, vessels carrying oil from sanctioned countries are under pressure. American forces are conducting interdiction operations. The message to every ship in the network is clear: you are being watched. Russia can condemn these actions. It can threaten responses. But without the naval power to challenge American interdiction in distant waters, Moscow's options are limited. What connects the Black Sea strikes, the tanker seizures, and the capture of Maduro? A pattern. The United States is demonstrating its willingness to use force, military, economic, legal, to impose its will. Capture a president? Done. Seize ships in international waters? Done. Enforce American law on vessels flying foreign flags? Done. For Washington, this is maintaining order. For much of the rest of the world, it increasingly looks like something else. Russia's strikes on cargo vessels in the Black Sea are framed as aggression. America's seizure of tankers in the Atlantic is framed as law enforcement. The framing reveals everything about who controls the narrative and who benefits from the double standard. We are in a dangerous moment. Great power competition has returned to the seas. The Black Sea is contested with missile strikes and drone attacks. The Atlantic sees American forces conducting interdiction operations. Russia, China, Iran, and Venezuela find themselves aligned against what they view as American overreach. Whether this alignment deepens into a formal bloc remains to be seen. The rules that governed international commerce for decades are being challenged. By drones, by missiles, by boarding parties. Global trade depends on the expectation that ships can sail safely under recognized flags, protected by international law. That expectation is eroding. The world watches as these events unfold. In Moscow, officials condemn American seizures while defending Russian strikes in the Black Sea as retaliation. In Beijing, analysts draw conclusions about American willingness to project power and what it might mean for Taiwan. In Ankara, diplomats work to prevent the conflict from spreading further into Turkish waters. In Washington, officials declare their operations successful. Another tanker seized, another adversary pressured. And in the ports and shipping lanes that connect the global economy, captains and crews sail through increasingly dangerous waters, uncertain what lies ahead. The Black Sea crisis is not ending. It is evolving into something larger, more consequential for the international order. Today, it is cargo ships and oil tankers. Tomorrow, it could be much more. The world watches and waits.